Thank you for tuning into this video on judicial selection. Now, when we say judicial selection, we're talking about choosing federal judges, not state judges, not local judges, federal judges. So district court, circuit court, Supreme Court, those are the big ones. Now, the lower courts are anything that's not the Supreme Court. So things made by Congress, district court, circuit court, and the president doesn't really play an active role. I mean, the Constitution says that the president appoints someone and that the Senate chooses to approve them or not approve them. But with the lower courts, it tends to be the White House that takes a leading role. They handle the nomination, they investigate, they contact senators from that state. So if we have a district court opening in Wisconsin, Obama's going to contact or not Obama, but his staff is going to contact the senators from Wisconsin, and they're going to see if they approve of the candidate they've come up with. And this is called senatorial courtesy. It's a way to try and get the senators on your side, show that you're including them in the decision making, and hopefully try to get these people appointed and approved very, very quickly. And it tends to work very well. There's nothing in the Constitution senators and get their opinions, but it tends to help with these lower court nominations to get them approved. Because imagine if Tammy Baldwin said, "Oh, I don't like this candidate," and then it could backfire on the White House staff because who knows more about that judge than the senator from the state where the judge is. So senatorial courtesy is really important for these lower courts. With the Supreme Court, the president really doesn't consider contacting any senators because the Supreme Court is over the entire nation. It takes a really close role in this. It's really focused because beyond the presidency, the Supreme Court can have a huge impact. So if you're president and appoint someone that's going to be around for the next 40 years, that means your presidency will have an impact for the next 40 years. And that is a huge deal for presidents because you can protect your legacy, you can protect the things you pushed for as president of the United States by choosing the right judges. I mean, there's no guarantee they'll actually follow through and support your ideas, but you like to think that they'll have an impact way beyond your presidency. They do have to get approved by the Senate, so you want to pick someone that's not going to be too extreme as well. So when the president's considering things, he's certainly going to want to pick someone that's more his ideology. So if you are a more liberal, appointed two more liberal judges. If you are a more conservative president like George W. Bush, he appointed two more conservative judges. But also the Senate likes to consider, just had an opening where a conservative judge just passed away. We would like another conservative judge to replace them. So it tends to be the Senate wants to kind of replace judges with similar judges, which may not always work. Now, certainly you look at their philosophy in interpreting the Constitution, which we'll talk about in a few slides. When picking a Supreme Court justice, you're going to want someone that's experienced, so someone that's been on the circuit court or the district court. You're going to want someone that's well educated. All our Supreme Court judges have been from some of our top law schools like Yale and Harvard, so they have great educational background. They have experience being on the circuit court, so they have a lot of experience handling these laws. You definitely want to, as a president, think about, is this person going to get approved? So you're going to think a candidate that's going to get approved by the Senate. For example, Barack Obama right now has a Senate that is Republican. So he wanted to pick a more conservative judge to replace Antonin Scalia. Merrick Garland, which is a little bit more conservative leaning. He's kind of moderate, but more conservative leaning. Trying to get Merrick Garland. The Senate chose to hold off and have the next president pick the Supreme Court pick to replace Scalia. Now, another thing that's kind of changed over time, first of all, you want someone that's going to be around for a while, so age tends to play a factor. But you can't have them be too young and too inexperienced for this type of position. More recently, gender and race have played a role, trying to make the Supreme Court more representative of the people, more diverse. So we have seen African American justices. We've seen our first Hispanic justice. So we've seen an expansion into diversity. But we've seen becoming a factor. It used to be that Almost all of the Supreme Court was Protestant. They typically had one person that was Catholic, one person that was Jewish. But we've kind of moved away from that being an important factor. In today's world, we have more of a mix of just Jewish and Catholic judges. So it's not because they've sought out Jewish and Catholic candidates per se, but more so because they've just stopped really considering that a major factor when choosing judges. And lastly, campaign promises can certainly affect. Donald Trump, during his most recent campaign, said that he was going to pick from this list of 20-some judges that he basically published out there, showing that he can pick good candidates. So most likely, Trump will pick from that list that he promised to pick from during his campaign. Here's a great chart showing you where the ideologies of the Supreme Court justices kind of lie. They've all been on the circuit courts before. When they're actually getting approved, a lot of media gets involved. So, for example, there's media coverage of the hearings, there's media coverage of the questioning, there's media coverage of everything. And the media likes to scrutinize a lot of stuff. Said can be scrutinized by the media heavily. Chances of getting approved. Especially because the media loves to investigate into your past. So if they can find something, some scandal, that could hurt you. So a president likes to pick someone that's scandal-free to try and avoid any confrontation from Senate. And there's always a weird question about how do we pick a Chief Justice? Now, there's only an opening for a Chief Justice when the Chief Justice is vacant. So the president gets to pick the Chief Justice whenever there's an opening. And in fact, if you were president, you may never get to pick a Supreme Court justice. You're waiting for one to either pass away or to retire or to be impeached. And that is not likely to happen. So as a president, you may not get an influence in the Supreme Court. So you got to make a good decision when you have that opportunity available. The last key thing is something I mentioned earlier. There's two real ways of looking at the Constitution. You can look at it as an originalist, someone that wants to look back to our founders and the original interpretation of the Constitution, what the founders felt, what the founders thought. And that is certainly one way of looking at it. It's kind of like what we call strict constructionalist. So looking at the Constitution, it clearly says this. So there's nothing implied. It just says this. If you're a living constitutionalist, though, you tend to believe that the Constitution is living and breathing and changing and adapting today than it would have been interpreted 200 years ago. And it tends to lead to what we call judicial activism, to judges that are making changes. So some judges believe that we should be following the Constitution very strictly, very specifically to what it says, very much what the founders believed. And some judges believe that we should be adjusting our interpretation to the times, to these laws, striking down laws that are seen as backwards to the Constitution. So, two ways of looking at it, and they certainly come up in the hearings and discussions from the Senate. That's all I'm going to talk about with federal judicial selection. Feel free to ask me more questions in class, though.